Hey, what's up everyone? Here is Sam Pelletier, and today I'll be talking about the difference between a passive muscle stretch versus an active muscle stretch. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to use the word muscle stretch, but you could very well use the word muscle lengthening or potentiation. Just before we jump in, we're going to talk a bit about the definition of both passive and active stretch. So a passive stretch would be basically the action of stretching a muscle because there's an external force, there's an external driver being applied on a joint. Like for example, as if I would want to stretch the backside of my thighs, my hamstring, I would simply let myself fall as if I would want to touch my toes. So that would be gravity being an external force being applied on my trunk, and then my trunk would fall forward, or me hanging on a door frame to stretch my pecs. Again, that would be gravity. Or another example of an external driver would be either someone or a therapist dragging my arm into a position that would create a pectoral stretch, or me simply dragging my neck to stretch one side of my neck. So that would be a passive stretch because the driver is external. It's not something that my body is doing. As far as active stretch goes, it's basically the opposite. So instead of having an external driver being applied on my joints, on my body, it's my own body, my own brain and body that does the job. And I'm gonna stay simple there. There's a lot of variables and there's a lot of factors to weigh in to the whole situation, but like I said, I'm gonna stay simple. I'm only gonna talk about muscles acting on other muscles. So a really simple and short example of what an active stretch would be. So basically, if I were to to contract my bicep, that would create a muscle lengthening or a muscle stretching of my tricep. So that would be an active stretch. Now that both have been defined, I'm going to use this little model that I built to explain, to help you visualize the effect of what a passive and an active stretch has on your body. So in this model, the ring in the middle would represent the position of a joint. For example, if I were to use my elbow to illustrate the whole concept, so my elbow would be at 90 degrees, so I would have 50% range of motion on one side and 50% range of motion on the other side. So if I were to extend my elbow, I would move that ring on one end, and if I were to flex my elbow, I'd move the ring on the other end. So that would give me a total of 100% of range of motion. But bear in mind, even if this is really linear and I'm only showing you guys an example with my elbow, this could very well be applied to the whole body in all planes of motion. For passive stretching, like I said, passive stretch is an external driver being applied on our joint, creating a lengthening, creating a stretching of a muscle group or a muscle. So in that example, that would be something like this, where my finger is an external driver that would drive the ring to one end, and that would create a stretching of a group of muscle. I could also go on the other side and pay attention to what's going on here. When I push the joint, the ring, into position, yes, this is being stretched, but look on that side, that band doesn't have any tension. It's actually getting too loose, and I gotta retain it for it to not to fall. All right, so that would be passive stretching. Again, the external driver would be my finger, myself dragging the joint into a given position, creating that stretch of a muscle. For active stretching, things would be a bit different. Instead of having this external force dragging the joint into a position, the main driver would be internal. The main driver would be a group or a muscle contracting, creating that lengthening, that stretching of the opposite muscle group or single muscle. So again, it would be the muscles contracting that would change the position of that joint, and that would result into the opposite muscle group being lengthened, being stretched. Now hear this, guys, because this could very well be the most important part of this whole video. When you do a passive stretch, like I said, it's an external force being applied on your joint. So there's a problem going on, because as you can see, this band, there's no tension in it. It's loose. So even if you're stretching, your brain and your body are not learning how to contract these to stretch these ones. So on the long run, what that creates is what we could call joint instability or hypermobility. And that's a big problem if your joints become unstable, because essentially you need that tension to hold your joint in space, and you need your brain and body to actually use those new ranges of motion, which is not happening when you do passive mobilization or passive stretching. And on the long run, if you don't have that tension and your joints become loose, even if it's really slight, basically your cartilage, your ligament, your bones, and your joints, they wear out faster than what they would normally do. So the moral of the story for today, guys, is if you stretch, you got to do it actively. You got to make your body and your brain learn how to move in space to stretch those muscles, to stretch those tissues. Because if you don't do that, well, basically you're just not going to age very well. I really hope that this whole video gets you clarity on the subject, and if it did, please take a moment to comment your takeaways in the comment section, or your questions if you got any. Like the video, share it with your friends, share it with your surrounding, because that kind of info really has to go out for people to really learn to help themselves take care of their health without hurting themselves later down the road. So it's really been a pleasure, and see you next time.